My name's Dylan. I'm 34, married, and a dad to two kids, Ethan, 8, and Lily, 6. For context, my family has always had this strange dynamic where my younger sister, Claire, could do no wrong. I used to think it was just the typical youngest child gets spoiled thing, but as I got older, I realized it was something much deeper and uglier. Growing up, my parents constantly compared me to her. If I brought home an A, Claire brought home creativity. If I worked 2 jobs in college, Claire needed to focus on herself. No matter what she did, they framed it as brilliance or uniqueness. Me? I was just there to be responsible. I learned early on not to expect much from them. Birthdays were often an afterthought. Holidays a performance where Claire was the star. My wife, Hannah, noticed it the first Christmas she spent with my family. She tried to be polite, but after seeing Claire get a $700 camera while we got matching mugs for the both of you, even she couldn't hide her confusion. Still, I kept going back. Maybe it was habit, maybe guilt. My mom had this way of making me feel like I was selfish for even noticing the difference. "We love you both equally," she'd always say. "Claire just needs a little extra help." That extra help somehow turned into years of unpaid loans, rent my parents covered, and them babysitting her kids every weekend while ignoring ours. Fast forward to this past December. My parents decided to host Christmas at their house again. Hannah was hesitant to go. I was too, honestly. But my dad had called saying, "We'd really like the kids here this year." He sounded genuine, almost warm. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We drove 3 hours to their place. The moment we arrived, I could tell things hadn't changed. My mom barely looked up from arranging the table when we came in. Claire, on the other hand, walked in 20 minutes later and was greeted like a celebrity returning from a world tour. My parents actually clapped. I wish I were exaggerating. Claire's husband, Mason, shook my hand like he was doing me a favor. He's one of those guys who always wears sunglasses indoors and refers to himself as an entrepreneur, even though his business seems to change every few months. The way he spoke to my dad made me uncomfortable. Too casual, too confident, like he knew something I didn't. Dinner went as usual. My mom bragged about Claire's new consulting venture. My dad asked Mason about his latest project, and no one asked Hannah or me a single thing about our lives. My kids were quiet the whole time, poking at their food. Ethan whispered to me, "Grandma didn't say hi to us." I told him she was just busy, but deep down I knew he was right. After dinner, we gathered in the living room for presents. My dad handed out gifts from under the tree, smiling the whole time. The first few went to Claire's family, brand-name clothes, gadgets, expensive toys for her kids. Then he reached for a big envelope with a gold bow and said, "Now this one's special." He handed it to Claire. She opened it, gasped, and immediately started crying. Mason shouted, "No way." Everyone leaned in. I saw the words "Luxury Family Vacation" printed across a travel agency folder. My dad chuckled. "You guys deserve it. All-inclusive, 5-star resort. You've both worked so hard this year." My mom nodded with this soft, proud smile. "You've earned it." Then she turned to me and said, "Oh, Dylan, you and Hannah have some gifts too." She handed us a small bag each. Hannah opened hers first. Inside was a pair of socks with little snowflakes. Mine was almost the same, socks, and a mug that said #OneDad. I tried to laugh it off, but something in my chest twisted. Hannah gave me a look that said everything she didn't dare say aloud. My kids didn't understand, but they noticed. Ethan asked, "Where's our big present?" My mom's smile faltered just for a second before she said, "Maybe next year, sweetheart." Grandpa and Grandma had to prioritize. Claire laughed softly. "It's okay, Mom. They'll understand." That was the moment something broke in me. It wasn't about the gifts. It was years of being treated like I was less, and watching my kids start to notice it too. I looked at my dad, who was leaning back, satisfied, and said quietly, "You really don't see it, do you?" He frowned. "See what? How you treat us." He shrugged. "Dylan, I told you not to expect anything from me. That way you can't be disappointed." Mom chimed in with a sigh. "Don't make this a scene, please. It's Christmas. You know how your father is. It's just how life is." Claire shifted uncomfortably, pretending to care. "Come on, Dylan, it's just socks. Don't be so serious." I stood up. "No, Claire, it's not just socks." Hannah quietly gathered our kids' coats. My mom's face tightened. "Where are you going?" "Home," I said. "We've had enough." No one stopped us. No one apologized. They just watched as we walked out. That night, I barely slept. The anger and hurt kept looping in my mind. I kept thinking about my dad's words, "Don't expect anything." The next morning, after I dropped the kids off at a friend's for a play date, I opened my laptop. I wasn't planning on doing anything dramatic, but then I remembered something my dad had done years ago, something I'd never shared outside the family. Let's just say, when I hit post, I didn't expect the reaction it got. Within hours, my cousins were texting me nonstop. And that was before my phone started ringing, with my mom's name flashing on the screen. I didn't answer when my mom called that morning. I just stared at the screen until it went dark. Then it lit up again. Same name. I let it ring. I wasn't ready to hear her voice yet, not after what she said the night before. Hannah was still half asleep when she came out of the bedroom, rubbing her eyes. "Is that your mom again?" she asked quietly. "Yeah," I said. "She's been calling nonstop." She poured herself some coffee and leaned against the counter. "You posted it, didn't you?" I nodded. Her lips parted slightly, like she wanted to say something but wasn't sure what. Then she just said, "Good." I didn't feel good, though. My hands were still trembling when I thought about it. I'd written the post after tossing and turning all night, replaying my dad's words in my head. "Don't expect anything from me." The more I thought about it, the more it stopped sounding like tough love and started sounding like something far more cruel, a man who was proud of his own indifference. So, around 2 a.m., I opened my laptop. I wasn't planning revenge, not exactly. I just wanted to tell the truth. For years, my relatives had seen my parents as the picture-perfect couple, generous, traditional, family-oriented. My mom always made sure to send out long Christmas newsletters bragging about Claire's achievements and carefully sprinkling in small updates about our son Dylan and his family. I was never mentioned by name beyond that. So, I decided to write my own version of a family update. I began by telling the story of how my parents had treated us growing up, the endless favoritism, the dismissed birthdays, the loans they gave Claire that somehow turned into gifts, the way they made me feel guilty for asking for the smallest things. I described, in detail, what happened at Christmas. The socks, the mug, the vacation envelope. But the part that made my cousins text me in shock wasn't any of that. It was the story from when I was 16. When Claire got her first car at 17, it was a brand new hatchback that my dad bought her as a reward for staying out of trouble. I never got a car. Instead, I saved for 2 years to buy a used one, only for my parents to borrow it one weekend while I was at a friend's house. They told me later it had been an accident, but they'd driven it to visit my grandparents and ended up totaling it on an icy road. Insurance didn't cover it because the policy was in my name. They never replaced it. That was the part that everyone had forgotten about, because my parents had never told anyone what really happened. My dad had apparently told the family that I had crashed the car and that he'd help me pay off the debt. So in that post, I set the record straight. When I woke up that morning, it had already been shared several times within the family group chats. My cousin Julia texted first, "Dylan, is this real?" Then another message from Mark, "Dude, you actually said it. Everyone's talking about it." By noon, half of my extended family had reached out. Some were sympathetic. Some were awkward. A few said things like, "Maybe you shouldn't air family stuff online." But even those messages were followed by, "I had no idea they treated you that way." The one that hit me the most came from my Aunt Denise, my mom's sister. We weren't close, mostly because my mom had always spoken badly of her. She wrote, "Dylan, I'm sorry. I tried to tell your mom years ago that she was favoring Claire too much, but she stopped speaking to me over it. You didn't deserve that." That message stayed with me. By the afternoon, my dad finally called. When I didn't pick up, he sent a text. "Take that down right now. You're making a fool of yourself." No apology. No explanation. Just that. Then came another one, a few minutes later. "You think you're hurting us? You're only embarrassing yourself." I stared at the screen for a long time. The words felt like him. Cold, mechanical, never once taking responsibility. Hannah sat beside me on the couch, scrolling through her phone. "You don't have to respond," she said. "I know," I replied. "But I kind of want to." She glanced at me. "Just be careful what you say. He's not going to change." I nodded. She was right. But part of me needed to say something. So I typed back, "I'm just telling the truth. You can call it embarrassing if it helps you sleep, but I'm done pretending it didn't happen." I didn't send it right away. I hesitated for almost a minute before pressing send. When I finally did, I felt this strange calm settle over me, like I'd exhaled for the first time in years. My dad didn't respond, but 10 minutes later, my mom called again. This time, I picked up. Her voice came through tight, trembling. "Dylan, what did you do?" "I told the truth," I said quietly. "You're destroying our family." "Mom, you destroyed it a long time ago." I just stopped covering for it. There was silence on the line. For a moment, I thought she might actually apologize, but instead she said, "You have no idea what you've started. Your father is furious." I laughed once softly. "He's always furious. The only difference is now people see it." Then she said something that stuck with me. "Do you really think anyone will believe you over us?" That sentence hit harder than anything else she'd said. It wasn't just arrogance, it was a confession. They had built their image so carefully that they actually believed their version of the story couldn't be challenged. "I guess we'll find out," I said, and hung up. That night, Hannah and I took the kids to get ice cream. We didn't talk about my parents. It felt good to be out, to laugh with Ethan and Lily, to just feel normal. For once, Christmas didn't end with me feeling small. But the peace didn't last long. 2 days later, my cousin Julia called. "Dylan, you might want to check Facebook," she said. I opened the app and saw it instantly. My mom had posted a long, dramatic message about family betrayal and false accusations meant to tear apart loved ones. It was written in that same sugary tone she used in her Christmas newsletters, but now she was painting herself and my dad as victims of a hurtful misunderstanding. The comments were full of sympathy from their friends. "You two are such good parents. Ignore the negativity. Some kids just don't appreciate what they have." It was like watching a performance, one they'd rehearsed their whole lives. But underneath the post, there were comments from family members, people who had seen my post first. Julia wrote, "Maybe there's another side to this story that should be heard." Aunt Denise added, "It's not a misunderstanding when it's a pattern." Within hours, the comment section turned into a quiet war zone. I didn't reply to any of it. I didn't need to. The truth was doing the work for me. Still, the more attention it got, the angrier my parents became. They started messaging relatives privately, trying to convince them that I'd twisted everything. Some cousins believed them, some didn't. But the one thing they couldn't undo was that now everyone knew. By the end of that week, something unexpected happened. Claire texted me. Her message was short. "You've really messed things up this time." I stared at her name for a long time before replying. "I'm just tired of pretending everything's fine." She replied almost instantly. "You're jealous, Dylan. You always have been. That's the real issue here." I almost laughed. That was the same line my mom had used my entire life whenever I pointed out the unfairness. But before I could even type a response, another message came through from her. "You have no idea what you've started." It was almost word for word what my mom had said. That's when I realized they weren't scared of embarrassment. They were scared of what might come next. Because I hadn't told everything yet. And if they wanted to play that game, I had something far worse than a Facebook post. Something that would make every perfect parent photo they'd ever posted crumble. After that initial shockwave of posts and private messages, I spent most of the next morning pacing in my living room, half drinking my coffee, half scrolling through the family group chats on my phone. Every new notification made my stomach tighten, a mix of anticipation and dread. I knew my parents were working overtime behind the scenes, calling relatives, spinning their story, and trying to keep the narrative in their favor. But even with their influence, I could feel the tide shifting. I didn't post anything else that day. I wanted to watch, to see the first cracks appear. And the cracks did appear, slowly at first. My Aunt Denise sent another message, longer this time. "I've been on the fence about saying anything for years, but Dylan, your post, it's true. I see it now. I see how my sister and brother-in-law have favored Claire and ignored you, and you've been carrying that burden silently. I'm sorry I stayed quiet." Her words hit me in a way I didn't expect. For years, she had been distant, partly because of my mom's constant manipulation. But here she was, finally admitting she'd known something was off. I almost texted her back immediately, but I paused. I wanted to savor this. Meanwhile, the other cousins were reacting in ways that were revealing. Some were outraged that my parents had been playing favorites all these years. Others were conflicted because, like me, they had always been told to appreciate what you have. Some, like my cousin Theodore, just asked questions quietly. "Dylan, what really happened with the car?" That one hit hard, because Theodore was close to Claire growing up, and he had never known the truth. The situation escalated further that evening. I was at home with Hannah, the kids playing quietly in the next room, when my phone buzzed with a string of messages. I glanced at it and froze. It was my dad, not a text. A message in the family chat that everyone could see. Everyone should know that Dylan's post is exaggerated. He has always been jealous of Claire, and this is nothing more than his attempt to rewrite history. Family comes first, and some people just can't see that. I felt my chest tighten. That classic line, family comes first, that my parents had always used to justify their behavior, was now their weapon. But I didn't panic. I had time. I had a plan. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about every single slight, every moment I'd been dismissed, every time my parents had used Claire as a mirror to measure my failures. But something clicked. The post had already shifted things. I realized the leverage I had wasn't public embarrassment. It was the truth, carefully documented, ready to drop in pieces that my parents couldn't counter. The next morning, I got a text from Claire. I wasn't sure if I wanted to read it, but I did anyway. Dylan, you've crossed a line. You can't just throw family history around like this. Do you even realize what you're doing? I stared at it for a long time, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then, without typing anything, I set the phone down. By mid-morning, my mom started reaching out to cousins individually. I knew this because the messages started coming through from people forwarding texts to me. Mom says you're lying. She says you've twisted the story. I clicked through the messages and noticed a pattern. Every forwarded message included variations of the same phrase. Your father and I have only ever tried to do what's best for Claire. I realized they were desperate. They weren't trying to convince me. They were trying to convince the wider family. The more desperate they got, the more they revealed themselves. Then came the call from Theodore. He was upset, but he wasn't angry at me. Dylan, he said, voice low. I had no idea. I thought Claire's parents were being fair. I didn't respond immediately. I just let him sit with that thought for a few seconds. Finally, I said, it's okay. Most of us didn't see it until it was too late. Theodore was quiet again. Then he said something I hadn't expected. Are you planning to do more? I smiled. Depends on what happens next. That afternoon, Hannah came into the room with a concerned look. You've been quiet. What's going on in your head? I'm thinking, I said. Thinking about how much of this I want to show. She sat beside me. Dylan, don't get lost in it. You've done enough just by speaking the truth. I shook my head. No, it's not enough yet. Not until they understand the consequences of how they've treated us, how they've treated the kids. She didn't argue. She just held my hand and said nothing, which was exactly the support I needed. By the evening, I started receiving private messages from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. Some were cautious, almost afraid, like they were stepping into a minefield. Others were outright curious. What else do you know? One cousin, Melanie, went further. She sent me a private Facebook message. Dylan, you don't know what you're unleashing. Mom and Dad are not going to take this lightly. If they find out what you really know, it could get ugly. I laughed quietly to myself. Ugly, I murmured. They already made it ugly for decades. And that's when it hit me. The knowledge I had, the things I'd seen, the documents, the old letters from my dad bragging about giving Claire gifts and dismissing me, was more than enough leverage. I could reveal everything piece by piece, and they couldn't lie their way out of it. I started making a mental list. Every holiday they had played favorites, every gift that had been uneven, every helpful loan given to Claire that never had to be repaid. Then I thought about the kids. Ethan and Lily had already witnessed the difference in treatment this past Christmas. They might not understand it fully yet, but they had felt it. I couldn't let that go unnoticed. By the next morning, I knew what I had to do. I would wait for the right moment, a family gathering, where I could carefully orchestrate the truth to hit every single person who had been complicit in the narrative. I spent the day quietly preparing, going through old photos, receipts, letters, even a few voicemails that had been left years ago. Every piece was a puzzle, and for the first time in decades, I felt like I was assembling it for myself, for my kids, for Hannah. Then, late that night, I got a text from Claire. I didn't expect it. Dylan, stop. Whatever you're planning, stop. You don't want to ruin Christmas, do you? I stared at the screen, thinking about the countless ruined holidays, the ignored birthdays, the years I'd been dismissed, the Christmas Eve I spent last week watching my kids' faces as they realized they weren't worthy of anything special. I typed back slowly. This isn't about Christmas anymore, Claire. This is about years of truth catching up with lies. She didn't respond immediately, which was good. It gave me time to think, time to plan, because I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. And that's when the first real opportunity presented itself. A family gathering. One that they all thought would be harmless, where everyone would be in one room, laughing, pretending nothing had changed. I could see it clearly in my mind. The living room, the tree, the gifts, the smug looks on my parents' faces. The chance to make them confront the truth in a way they couldn't spin or dismiss. I didn't know exactly how it would go, but I knew this. After all these years of being invisible, of being treated as second-rate, I finally had a plan that couldn't fail, if I timed it right. First, the logistics. I didn't want it to look like an ambush. I asked Hannah if she and the kids could come early under the pretense of helping my mom with last-minute things. She agreed without hesitation, because that's who she is, supportive, practical, good with people. Ethan and Lily were excited at the idea of helping Grandma set the table. My kids still had that naive belief in family being simple, and I wanted to protect that as long as I could, even while I set things up. Next, I quietly coordinated with the cousins who had messaged me, Denise, Theodore, Melanie, and Julia. I told them I wasn't going to out anyone publicly or yell. I wanted facts to speak louder than theatrics. Most of them were on board because they'd already seen some of the evidence in the group chats and privately admitted they'd felt uneasy about some of their parents' stories for a while. Denise, bless her, agreed to sit on the couch with her tablet ready. Theodore offered to film discreetly on his phone. Julia volunteered to act as a calming presence in case the kids got upset. Melanie said she'd bring copies of old emails she'd saved. Turns out my parents had CC'd relatives on those newsletters and sometimes slipped in justifications about supporting Claire's future, which read very different when taken literally. What I needed was a narrative arc. People are more convinced by a sequence of small things that add up than by loud accusations. So I assembled the pieces. Bank statements showing transfers labeled as gifts to Claire, the travel agency invoice for the luxury vacation, with dates that lined up suspiciously with money lent to Claire for rent earlier that year, photos of gifts with price tags in the background, and the smoking gun that made my stomach knot when I found it. A set of old emails my dad had sent to my aunt, praising himself for investing in Claire's independence and casually admitting arrangements that contradicted what he told everyone publicly. The old voicemail from when I was 17, the one where he told me not to worry because he'd take care of the car situation, but never did, I had transferred to my laptop. I also had receipts that proved the loan Claire kept saying she'd paid back was still outstanding the year after she got the camera and brand new car. I made a slideshow. I know it's petty. It's very modern revenge. Receipts, dates, photos, and quotes. But I also made a printed packet for anyone who wanted to read slowly and take things in. I didn't want the moment to be an accusation thrown and forgotten. I wanted it to be verifiable, slow, methodical. I wanted it to be undeniable and boring to anyone who'd rather believe the happy family story. On the day, my palms were damp as I carried the USB flashing with my slideshow. Hannah gave me a look that said she trusted me but wasn't thrilled about my appetite for confrontation. If you want them to listen, don't let it turn into an attack, she whispered. Let them see. I nodded. She kissed the corner of my mouth and helped Ethan and Lily hang a simple paper garland in the entrance. They were blissfully unaware. It felt obscene for a second, their small hands, my laptop full of other people's lies. My parents were, predictably, in control. My dad had already arranged the dining room with the best plates and had his classic proud host smile on. Claire arrived 15 minutes late with that easy breezy energy that always made her the center without her having to try. Mason swaggered in behind her, cheeks flushed like he'd just closed a deal. My cousin crew filtered in and took their places. It was crowded, warm, ordinary. The kind of scene you could frame and post with the caption, "Family Time." We ate. We pretended. I kept my mouth small and my voice calm. I made it a point to say thank you to my mom for the roast when she walked by, to show I wasn't trying to be cruel. I wanted the dissonance to be visible, normal family behavior on the surface, and beneath that, a slow reveal that would make the normal look less convincing. After dessert, while everyone was lingering over coffee, I asked if I could say something. My dad raised an eyebrow and smiled faintly. Theo, "Here we go" expression. My mom squeezed my hand like she was trying to keep me from saying anything truly shameful. She didn't know the extent of what I had. Claire looked mildly irritated, like this was inconvenient. Mason looked like he already had a rebuttal ready in his head. I stood up, cleared my throat, and told them I'd brought something to share because there were a few family stories that had been told for too long without the full context. I told them it would be quick and that I only wanted to ask for honesty and for people to read the documents afterwards if they wanted to. My voice was steady, which surprised me. I chalked it up to sleep and adrenaline and a deep hunger to not feel small. Denise rolled over slightly in her chair and hit play on her tablet. Theodore pointed his phone at me, ready to film. I started with the car because it was something everyone vaguely remembered, the one they had all accepted as Dylan's mistake when I was a kid. I played the voicemail. My dad's voice filled the dining room, young and impatient. "I'll take care of it. I'll talk to the insurance. Don't tell your mother I let you drive it that night." The room grew quiet. My dad's face. I hadn't seen his expression change like that in years. It was a thin, controlled panic, as if a crack had formed in a sculpture he'd been polishing for decades. I moved through the slideshow with practiced calm. Dates, amounts, emails, receipts. The travel folder photo came up in the slide deck, and I watched Claire's smile falter for the first time. Mason's face, which had been so self-assured earlier, tightened. My mom started speaking under her breath, like she was composing herself to say something comforting and rehearsed. Halfway through, my Aunt Denise raised her hand. "Could you let that sink in?" she asked softly. I had no idea the money was moving like that. Her voice had that tremble of someone who had been holding back for years. That was all I needed, not to humiliate, but to illuminate. I let the silence hang. The kids came in then, drawn by the murmurs. Ethan looked around, puzzled. Lily tugged at my sleeve. I crouched down and told them, in a whisper, that everything was going to be okay, that sometimes grown-ups had to fix their own mistakes the hard way. As the slideshow wound toward the most damning emails, the ones where my dad wrote, in a mundane tone, "I've insured Claire is set up for the next few years," while listing the exact transfers and referring to them as investments. I felt a dizzying mix of relief and sorrow. Relief because the truth was finally visible. Sorrow because I realized how much of my parents' life was spent constructing a story that made them feel noble. My dad finally stood up. He looked like a man who'd been interrupted mid-speech. "Dylan," he said slowly, voice lower than I'd heard it in a long time, "you shouldn't be bringing family business out here." There was no anger in it so much as wounded dignity. "I'm not bringing gossip," I said. "I brought facts. And if you want to tell people you've only ever been generous, that's your choice. But the facts are here for anyone who wants to look." Claire was the first to speak for the family line. "You're obsessed," she said. "You always have been." It was the same playbook, deflect with personality critiques. But this time it sounded thin. At that moment, Theodore's film caught something I hadn't planned on. My mom, whispering to my dad with her hand over her mouth, saying, "We did what we had to do." My dad's reply was softer, almost a whisper of justification. "They don't understand what raising a prodigy takes." The words felt like an admission of motive more than protection. And in the quiet look I exchanged with Denise, I knew the tide had turned irreversibly. Then Mason, who had been mostly watching, straightened and announced loudly, "We did nothing wrong. We earned this." It was meant to be a defiant statement, but the way he said "earned" sounded brittle. He scanned the room as if he were looking for allies. For a second it felt like a pressure test. Would the family rally behind him and my sister, or would they start asking the hard follow-ups? I had rehearsed my next move in my head for hours. I had planned to hand out packets, to let people read slowly, to let the evidence do its work. But there was one more thing I had tucked away. A single email thread that tied everything together, a message from a cousin's spouse that my parents had blindly forwarded to the whole family, where my dad joked about keeping up appearances and, in doing so, acknowledged the performative nature of their generosity in a way that, if read in public, would fracture the story my parents told themselves every day. I reached into my pocket for the printed packet. I could feel the weight of the paper, of the moment. People were shifting in their seats. Claire's jaw clenched. My mom's hands were white on her lap. I stood up, hands slightly shaking but voice calm. "If you want to see the full picture," I said, "read this." I brought copies. I started handing them out, and then, And this is where it starts to blur. Theodore, who had been filming, got a message and looked down. His face changed. He showed the screen to Denise. They both looked at me with that peculiar expression people get when someone they trusted hands them information that rewrites a relationship. My dad moved toward me and put a hand on my shoulder. It was supposed to be a placating gesture. Instead, it felt like contact I hadn't consented to. He leaned in and said, quietly, "Stop this. For the kid's sake." His voice had a pleading quality I'd never heard before. I looked at my kids, at their faces full of confusion, then at my father. "For their sake," I echoed. "I'm doing this for them." At that exact second, the doorbell rang. It echoed through the house like an exclamation mark. Everyone started, and for an instant the air in the room shifted from tense to alarmed. My dad's hand left my shoulder. Claire's eyes darted toward the door. Mason cursed softly under his breath. My mom said, alarmed, "Now who could that be?" I didn't move. My heart was a drum. The room held its breath as my dad crossed toward the front hall and opened the door. The doorbell rang like punctuation, loud, unavoidable. My dad crossed the hall and opened it slowly, like he expected a neighbor with a pie or a cousin who'd forgotten their keys. Instead, a woman stood on the porch in a smart navy blazer, a man in a suit behind her, and a courier with a thick envelope to the side. The woman had a badge clipped to her coat and a polite, professional look that made everything else in the hallway feel amateurish. "Mr. Harper?" she asked. My dad's face tightened. "Yes. I'm Detective Rowan with the County Financial Crimes Unit, and this is Mr. Collins from the bank's compliance department. We have a few questions and a notice to serve regarding irregular transfers from your accounts to third parties, one of which has been flagged as potentially fraudulent. We'd like to speak with you." Time slowed. For the first time since I was a kid and my dad narrated stories as if he were a benevolent benefactor, he looked small. The proud posture that had been his armor for decades sagged like something that had been propped up too long. My mom's hand flew to her mouth. Claire's smile disappeared as if someone flipped a light switch. Mason's jaw clenched so hard I swear I could hear the strain. The courier handed my dad the envelope. Thick, stamped, official. He opened it with hands that trembled. The room hummed. Denise's tablet slipped and clattered to the rug. Theodore's phone kept filming, though his hands weren't steady anymore. People were whispering. Ethan wandered closer to see the commotion. Lily hid behind Hannah's skirt. Detective Rowan read out the short version as calmly as she could in front of everyone. "We have a complaint from a third party alleging that funds were knowingly mischaracterized and transferred in a way that violates the terms of certain loans and insurance claims. We're here to ask you to come down to the station for a voluntary interview and to inform you that legal counsel has been advised. We can leave the paperwork with you now." My dad's face went a hard, waxy white. He looked at my mom, then at Claire, then back at the officers. "This must be some mistake," he said, voice low. "We have always been careful. We've only ever helped family." Detective Rowan tilted her head, once as if to say she'd heard that defense many times before. "Helping family is not a defense to misrepresentation and may be subject to civil liability and potentially criminal investigation, depending on intent and documentation. We'll need to review bank statements and correspondence. If you have legal representation, we advise you to call them now." Mason, who had been growing red in the face since I started the slideshow, interrupted. "This is ridiculous. Who called you? Who would make these allegations?" He looked at me as if I were the villain. For a second the room bent toward panic. My mom started whispering, and my dad reached for the envelope like it might buoy him back to shore. Then Aunt Denise, steady and quiet, stood up and said, "We did not call you, detective." Her voice was soft but carried. "We've been sitting in this house for years watching family get lauded for behavior that wasn't what it seemed. My conscience couldn't carry it anymore. I did speak with someone, yes. I sent copies of emails and those newsletters. I didn't expect a formal probe. I expected honesty." You could almost hear the oxygen shift. It had the feel of a small dam cracking. My parents' defense, the neat framing they'd invested in for decades, simply wouldn't hold under that much visible scrutiny. Detective Rowan asked my dad some carefully precise questions about accounts, transfers, and whether he understood the terms of loans and insurances he'd signed or authorized. My dad's answers were evasive, legalistic, and for the first time wholly unhelpful. He stuttered over dates. He used vague verbs. He called everything help. The officers exchanged quiet looks that said volumes. One of them, Mr. Collins from the bank, sighed and said, "We've been trying to reconcile these entries for months. We flagged certain transfers as unusual, gifts labeled as loans, payments to third parties with unclear business purposes, repetitive transfers to the same beneficiary. We opened a formal inquiry after a creditor filed a claim that hasn't been properly accounted for." Claire tried to speak up and say it was all a misunderstanding. "There are always explanations," she said. "My parents have done a lot for me. I wouldn't have." Her voice slouched into the room like a bad prop. The detective's tone, professional and flat, cut right through it. "Ms. Bennett, part of our process is to quantify transfers and examine intent. If you have documentation proving repayment or business justification, please bring it forward. If not, your signatures on any agreements you acknowledged could be scrutinized." The word signatures landed like a stone. Mason's confident, practiced arrogance evaporated into a thin sheen of fear. He'd always talked about networks and investments in a way that made him sound larger, but now his bravado looked like cover. The whole family saw it. As the officers explained their next steps, that they'd be interviewing family members, possibly requesting subpoenas for financial records, and that civil action could follow, my parents went from indignation to pleading. My dad, who had lectured me for years about character and sacrifice, now looked busted, as if someone had peeled off his crafted image and left behind something brittle. My mom looked at the room as if asking for allies. Some came forward, awkwardly. Melanie said quietly, "I'm sorry. I had suspicions." Theodore, who had filmed everything, put his phone down and said, voice thick, "I don't want to be part of protecting lies anymore." Julia wiped her eyes and told my mom she'd always suspected the newsletters were odd, too glossy, too selective. People who'd once nodded politely and laughed in my parents' presence were no longer complicit. They were stepping out. At some point, my dad staggered backward and sat down as if the chair were a life preserver. He looked at me with a face I'd never seen before, an aging, defeated man who'd relied on stories to deny his own small cruelties. "Dylan," he whispered, "you've made a spectacle." "You made it a spectacle," I said, and I didn't try to be gentle. "You sold a story that made you the heroes, and you used your kids and our childhoods as props." Mom started to cry, but it wasn't the soft, desperately sympathetic weep that used to pull me back into alliances. This one sounded raw and private, like the sound of someone finally realizing they'd been enjoying a house built on a rotten foundation. What happened after that afternoon played out in two timelines, the bureaucratic one and the human one. In the bureaucratic timeline, Detective Rowan and Mr. Collins collected copies of the emails, receipts, and transfers I'd printed, and the bank pulled records for the accounts in question. Within a week, the bank froze a discretionary account my parents used for gifts. A letter followed from a law firm representing creditors seeking repayment and clarification of a series of loans that had been mischaracterized. An auditor requested additional documentation. The county's financial crimes unit opened a file and requested interviews. Those are blunt, ugly words, the kind that land and reverberate. Inquiry, audit, subpoena. In the human timeline, the aftermath was quieter but more savage. Relatives who'd taken the family narrative at face value reached out, shaken. Some apologized. Some wanted distance. Claire and Mason's carefully curated lifestyle, the vacations, the polished social media photos, the casual mentions of investments, came under a familiar kind of scrutiny. Neighbors asked questions they couldn't ignore. Friends stopped posting photos with them. A few clients who'd been considering consulting work quietly rescinded offers. Claire posted a long, plastic-sounding defense on her feed that read like every family newsletter my mom had ever written, polished and hollow. But the comments below were different now. People who had seen the documents showed up in the thread with details. The effect was like peeling wallpaper to reveal dry rot. My mom tried the old playbook, the hurt, the theatrical fragility that used to make everyone lean in and console her. But after what had been read aloud in their living room, and after bank letters and a visit from the detective, the performance didn't have the same audience. People who'd once leaned toward her with sympathy now tilted away, uncertain if they'd been co-opted into a story they might have to own. The cousins who supported me, Denise, Theodore, Julia, formed a small, quiet coalition. We met quietly, over coffee and texts, and discussed restitution in ways my parents had never considered necessary. It wasn't about me getting anything. It was about cleaning up a pattern of behavior. Some cousins suggested mediation. Others proposed that Claire and my parents sit down with family council and account for the transfers publicly to make restitution to any party who'd been harmed. I didn't want legal theater. I wanted consequences. I wanted accountability. Claire and Mason reacted in predictable ways. Claire flinched, then lashed out, accusing me of jealousy and betrayal. Mason contracted, became defensive, and then distant. They posted defensive messages and took sanctuary in the small circle of relatives who still wanted to preserve appearances. But in the months that followed, there were no more luxury vacations announced from their accounts. There was less social media. Phone calls from past benefactors dwindled. In private, I heard via other cousins that Mason was struggling to line up his next venture. Clients had begun asking questions about past invoices. The silk of their life frayed. My parents, meanwhile, faced more concrete fallout. The bank required audits and forced a restructuring of funds. Creditors sought repayment of questionable loans. The county inquiry continued, and any determination of intentional misrepresentation could have criminal consequences, a prospect that hung over family gatherings with a hollow threat. It was wrenching to watch, because it meant watching people I'd once hoped would soften with age confront the reality of consequences that matched their actions. It wasn't vindictive, it was accountability. It was what had been missing for years. At home, Hannah and I made choices. We limited contact. The kids called them once on their birthday, and my parents left a voicemail full of brittle warmth. We returned a few calls that felt necessary, but the old relationship, the one where I'd drop everything because of guilt or ritual, was gone. I set firm boundaries and kept them. My parents called, begged, offered explanations that sounded rehearsed and convenient. I listened enough to be humane, then stepped back. Forgiveness was not a transaction I was interested in pursuing. I wanted safety for my family and clarity for my children. I wanted them to see that their grandfather, the man who once said, "Don't expect anything from me," like it was philosophy, could be fallible and accountable. People asked me, after the dust settled a bit, if I felt satisfied. The answer is complicated. There's a particular kind of peace in telling the truth, in peeling off a story that once suffocated you. There's also a cost. Family fractures and past cheery photos now served as evidence in the archive of betrayal. I watched my parents' social world shrink and their influence wane. I watched Claire lose some of the glow she'd used like armor. Some cousins reached out with gratitude. Others remained distant, unwilling to choose sides. Some people I thought would be allies surprised me. Some I thought would judge me stayed eerily quiet. Most important, Ethan and Lily learned a lesson that hadn't been possible while I was pretending everything was fine. Reputation can be manufactured, and kindness can be performative. I wanted them to grow up knowing that family comes first is not an automatic truth. It is a value you earn by showing up fairly and honestly. We rebuilt Christmas and birthdays slowly, deliberately. We made our home a place where the kids saw equitable treatment rewarded. After everything, Hannah and I felt unburdened in a way we'd never been. We were finally living by the rules we wanted for our children. As for my parents, the legal and financial process took months. No dramatic courtroom scene unfolded in a single day. Life rarely moves like a movie. There were interviews, letters, requests for documentation, and the slow drain of social capital. The bank demanded clearer accounting. Some creditors pursued civil claims. My parents retained counsel and spun stories about misunderstandings and generational differences. They tried damage control in the manner they knew best: newsletters, carefully curated holiday gatherings, and attempts to charm relatives back. But the veneer was gone. People remembered the slideshow and the voicemail. They remembered my dad's voice promising to take care of the car, and the detective's professional calm. The cumulative weight of evidence made polite denial ineffective. Claire and Mason, stripped of some of their social gloss, tried to rally support among the more loyal relatives, but there was little left to rally. Friends who'd once envied their life distanced themselves quietly. The life they'd been building on borrowed esteem became more precarious. I won't pretend there wasn't pain watching a family implode. There was. I felt for the younger relatives caught in the crossfire and for anyone who'd been hurt by my parents' choices. But the person I felt least sympathy for was my father. not because he was always cruel, but because he'd repeatedly rationalized it and taught me that conditional love was acceptable. He'd set a pattern for himself and for my sister that had consequences. Months later, after the inquiries and letters and a few small settlements, the family gatherings changed form. They were cooler, more formal, or they happened without my parents present. The narrative that had been my childhood, the one that ranked people by who matched my parents' script, collapsed. People were kinder now in a practical, less performative way. Cousins texted more honestly. My kids were treated as kids, not props. Those things mattered more than any public vindication. I want to be unequivocal about one thing. I did not forgive them. Forgiveness felt like surrendering the lesson I'd spent years trying to honor for my children. I set boundaries that were permanent. I refused to normalize the unequal way they'd treated my family. They called, pleaded, and tried to guilt me with memories we'd once shared. I listened enough to be civil, then closed the door. Regret is not the same as accountability. I wanted the latter. In the end, what happened was simple in its arc and complex in its aftermath. I told the truth publicly. I gathered evidence. Cousins and a few brave relatives corroborated or came forward, and an official inquiry followed that revealed the scale of my parents' misrepresentations. The consequences were financial audits, frozen accounts, legal letters, and reputational collapse. Claire and Mason lost some of their social standing and opportunities. My parents faced potential civil liabilities and the ongoing strain of an investigation. The family was fractured, but, for the most part, clearer. We rebuilt our holiday traditions on honesty and fairness. I stopped pretending they were the benevolent, perfect parents they presented themselves to be. They became, in public and private, people facing the consequences of choices they'd made for decades. Was it cruel? Perhaps, but staying silent felt crueler. My children deserved better than a legacy of favoritism disguised as generosity. So I made a choice: truth over comfort, accountability over performative sameness, and boundaries instead of old, destructive rituals. In the months that followed, the legal and financial consequences settled into a slow, inevitable rhythm. My parents were forced to restructure their accounts, repay some debts, and attend meetings with auditors and legal advisors. Claire and Mason quietly retreated from the social circles they'd flaunted for years, their luxurious vacations and lavish displays no longer a shield. The cousins who had once gone along with the favoritism slowly aligned with truth, some apologizing for staying silent, others simply keeping their distance. For my part, I focused on my family, Hannah, Ethan, and Lily. We rebuilt holidays and birthdays with fairness, laughter, and traditions that weren't tainted by favoritism. The kids learned a lesson about honesty, accountability, and boundaries without growing up under the shadow of my parents' manipulations. As for my parents, the proud, controlling personas they had spent decades cultivating crumbled. They tried to charm relatives, plead, and justify their actions, but the truth was out. Their influence was diminished, and their carefully constructed image lay in ruins. I didn't forgive them. I didn't need to. Accountability had replaced illusion, and that was enough. In the end, I walked away from the chaos with my children's trust intact, my conscience clear, and the knowledge that some truths, once revealed, cannot be ignored. My parents were left to face the reality of the consequences they had long ignored, and I finally felt free. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this.